Ken, one of the things that we read when we were going through our Matthew 24 series was the phrase, coming in the clouds of heaven and with power and great glory. What is this what's the right phrase? It's a biblical theme, right?
It's a biblical theme, yeah.
What is Jesus literally coming back on clouds visibly, or does this mean something else?
I think it means something else. When we were going through Matthew 24, I stated in that video that we had already done our theming video on that, so I skipped past it. And it was later that you and I realized, I don't think we have. I've taught it so many times, I forget where I taught it. I do think it means something else. And again, people will be so sick of hearing me say it, but you use the Bible both as your dictionary, or your glossary, to find the words, and your dictionary to define the words. So when we see a phrase like this, especially spoken of in an apocalyptic sense, in a prophetic sense, which is how Jesus was using it in Matthew 24, then we have to go back and see the theming of it to see how they would have understood it. And in this sense, coming on the clouds, or the phrase, or even what a cloud is at all, is referring to coming in judgment. A cloud is often referred to as a reference to the presence of God. And so we see, a cloud when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai. It's symbolizing that the Lord, his presence is in the cloud. We see the smoke come up from the sacrifice to know that the Lord's presence was in the Holy of Holies and consumed the sacrifice. The children of Israel led by a pillar of fire by night and cloud by day. These are themings all the way through the Bible as the presence of the Lord. Let's just go ahead and begin. This will be just a short study. Isaiah 19, verse 1, the burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud and shall come down into Egypt. Well, obviously, the Lord Yahweh, the Father, does not ride on a cloud. It's not like you would see somebody riding a bus in downtown. You wouldn't look up and see a cloud that the Lord's in. This is in a lot of ways, this is like a personification. This is giving personhood, or giving a materialistic physicalness to an immaterial spirit. And so when he says, I'm riding a cloud and I'm coming down to visit, none of those things happen. In fact, we know other armies or other means that we've talked about before, much like the Romans were used to punish Jerusalem in the Roman-Jewish War. In that same way, the Lord uses other nations to judge other nations and uses armies as his punishing tool. And so here, the way that he communicates that by Isaiah, talking about the burden of Egypt, he communicates that by simply saying, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud and shall come into Egypt. So that's just the way the terminology is used. When he says that, what it means is, following the theming of the cloud, is my presence will be there. And a swift cloud, or a cloud of the Lord riding a cloud, has the idea of him riding a horse, or it would be like a tank or a chariot, a tank of our day, a chariot of their day. His cloud is like his chariot.
He used another nation to do his work.
That's a very, very important observation, is that it wasn't the Lord coming down himself. The phrase of him coming in a cloud, or a swift cloud, is him using another nation to destroy them.
Okay.
That's the most important thing. Let's go to Nahum chapter 1. In verse number 1, for context, the burden of Nineveh. So here's another burden. That when we talk about burden, we're talking about woe to them. This will be a burden for them. It's a life-changing idea. Verse 3, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord hath his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Now, it's very important people understand the Lord doesn't have feet. Yahweh is a spirit. He doesn't have feet. So this is another example of a personification. So when you are, from your perspective as a human being, looking up at the clouds, the Bible is suggesting that he walks on those. His perspective is much higher than ours. He's above us. In fact, it's kind of like the dust is below your feet when you walk on the ground. That's kind of like the clouds. His perspective, He's so much greater than us. The clouds are kind of like the dust on his feet. He doesn't have feet. It's a way for us to understand his might and his power. This is a lot like the emotional trauma that Job went through, and his psychological trauma, his spiritual trauma of losing his family and losing all that he's ever known or cared for. And in chapters 38 through 42, God asks him a series of questions. I'm actually writing a lengthy paper on this right now. The series of questions that God asked Job were not to make Job feel bad about himself, but rather they were done to begin the healing process of Job so that Job could trust somebody who knows more than him. It wasn't to beat him down and say, I'm better than you, don't you dare question me. It was to get Job to understand, hey, all these things I'm asking you don't know the answer to, but I know the answer to, so you can trust me with the answers that you don't know. It's actually a healing process for Job. It's not a way for Job to feel bad about himself. All right? And here's the same way. He's so much higher than us. The clouds are like dust below his feet. He doesn't have feet, and he's not going anywhere. He's not coming to these nations. He's using somebody else to do that. It's just a way of talking. But I think perhaps I'm going to switch these for those that are listening. I'm going to switch these, and I'm going to go Daniel chapter 7 first, because I think this is the more important one to do first, because Jesus is quoting this. I just realized I did that out of order. Jesus is quoting that in Matthew 26. So let's go ahead and hit Daniel 7 first. Here's a prophecy that Daniel sees, and the beasts are destroyed. You can see that corresponds with our Revelation study when we get there. And we get to verse 13, and Daniel says, we've read these many times, I saw in the night visions and beheld one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven. That does not mean it was cloudy that day and he accidentally got a little bit of cloud on him. This is talking about the presence of God. It's talking about deity. It's talking about divine nature. And so with the presence of God, one like the Son of Man is coming with the clouds of heaven. And where did he go, folks? He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. So here we have Jesus' ascension in Acts chapter 1. That's when Jesus went up into the clouds, Acts 1:8, Acts 1:9. He goes up into the clouds. We're going to look at that in a second. And here, with the clouds of heaven, he goes up to the Ancient of Days. Look at verse 14. And there was given him dominion. Jesus is given authority over the nations at his ascension, and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. And dominion is an everlasting dominion. It has no end, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. So here is a prophecy that Caiaphas would have known very well. The prophecy is that one day the Messiah will come. It will be God himself. And the prophecy is that he will ascend with the clouds of heaven, go up to the Ancient of Days, and receive a forever kingdom and judge all the nations of the world. That's the prophecy. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 26. And in Matthew chapter 26, we see a very long chapter of Jesus dealing with his leading up to his arrest, his betrayal and arrest. And finally, he's before Caiaphas in verse 57. We're going to just read verse 64. So Caiaphas has this back and forth with Jesus. Caiaphas knew Daniel, and he would have been familiar with that prophecy we just read. Let's go to 61, sorry. And it said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God. They're talking about Jesus. And build it in 3 days. That's John chapter 2, if you want to read it. The high priest arose, that's Caiaphas, and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it with which these witnesses against thee? But Jesus held his peace. You can go back and read Isaiah 53. He was like a lamb before the slaughter, didn't open his mouth. Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Messiah, the Christ, Christos, the Son of God. Here's how Jesus answered Caiaphas. He said, thou hast said. In other words, you said what you said. Jesus was not making any big claims here, although Jesus did claim to be God. But he wasn't making it super clear because he knew he was going to be crucified. It tells us in 1 Corinthians that had they known he was the King of glory, they never would have crucified him. Best thing for everybody was for him to be crucified. Thou hast said. He says, nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. What Jesus is saying here to Caiaphas is he's saying to him, you are asking me if I'm king? Let's do this. He quotes to him Daniel 7:13 and 14. He says this, after this moment, I'm going to ascend to the Father. All the nations will be mine, and I'm coming in judgment against the apostasy and the transgression of the Mosaic covenant, the blessings and cursings, and you're going to see me sitting at the right hand of the Father when you see all of these things begin to take place. You're going to see it. And so that's what he's talking about when he's talking about coming on the clouds. He's referencing this theming of, I'm going to jump on my tank, I'm going to be in charge of the nations, and you're going to be the one to see it, Caiaphas. Lastly, let's just go to the book of Acts real quickly. I already mentioned it. But when Jesus at his ascension is taken up away and the disciples are there to see it, let's look in verse number 9. Jesus says his final words in 7 and 8. And it says in verse 9, and when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, it means they were physically, that's why it's saying that's while they beheld. This is a physical appearance of Christ. He's physically in front of them. They were looking at him. He was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they steadfastly looked toward heaven, as he went up physically, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel. They appeared. Verse 11. Which said, ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as you have seen him go into heaven. Here we have a physical presence of Jesus, physical ascension. They beheld him. They were told he will come in like manner, and he was taken up into a cloud into heaven. If you were to have a movie being played right now, Acts chapter 1 would be the movie camera going up. By the time you can't see Jesus anymore, the next movie shot would be Daniel 7:13 with the camera pointing down and seeing the top of him coming up into the Ancient of Days. And so this idea of clouds has the idea that God's presence is pulling him up. And we have here, he rides the cloud when he's angry and he's going to judge a nation. The clouds are like the dust underneath his feet. He's brought up into a cloud of the Ancient of Days, given a kingdom, going to judge everybody. And that's what he is quoting to Caiaphas when he says, you're going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, sitting at the right hand of the Father. So Caiaphas would understand. Now, let's make sense of this. In Matthew chapter 24, what's being said is Israel has fulfilled its purpose as being the arbiters of the old covenant, as being the ones who hold the testament, the tablets of stone, as it says in Hebrews, the old covenant. They've run their course. They've fulfilled their purpose. And now this old covenant is over. There's going to be a destruction of the temple in AD 70, and there's a new Jerusalem replacing this. And so God is coming and declaring his wrath and judgment upon apostate Israel and those not in covenant with him, according to the Mosaic curses that we see in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And really, it's not really much harder than just following the theming in that way.